thank you for setting some time aside to join New Pioneers this evening for our Moving Forward Forum focused on conservation easements. First, I'd like to introduce myself to those of you who I've not been able to meet yet. But my name is Whitney Wurzel, and I'm the Executive Director here at New Pioneers for a Sustainable Future. And for those of you who might be new to New Pioneers, just very briefly, I wanted to let you know that we are a nonprofit organization based in Washington County, Kentucky, and our mission is to promote sustainable thinking and sustainable development in rural communities. And we do that through education, demonstration, and advocacy. So part of that work tonight kind of fits into the education, even a little bit of demonstration as well, as we spread knowledge about conservation easements. And Moving Forward Forums is part of a larger program series that New Pioneers has offered for a number of years. However, this forum is special in and of itself because it is our first digital Moving Forward Forum. So that just makes our gratitude and appreciation even more immense that you were willing to join us for yet another Zoom gathering. So once again, thank you. In addition to myself, there are a couple of other staff members that are on here this evening that I'd like to recognize. Jane Rudnick is our education coordinator. She joined New Pioneers a couple of months ago through AmeriCorps, and she is with us for a year through the Environmental Education Leadership Program with AmeriCorps. So she is driving this technological ship. So if you hear me call on Jane for a little bit of help, that's exactly what's going on. She's helping me make sure the technology is moving right along. And in addition to Jane, we are also joined by our administrative coordinator, Lana Gitz. So I know she's somewhere there, and the two of us are in the office. So again, we thank you. And then there are also a number of board members and New Pioneers members on this call. So I just give a hearty digital hug to all of you for being a part of our New Pioneers family. So with that bit of a basic introduction out of the way as to who New Pioneers is, I want to talk a little bit about ground rules and just provide a basic overview for the evening because this is a new platform for us. First, I do want to let everyone know that we are recording this forum. And the reason for that is that there were a number of folks who couldn't attend, who couldn't join us this evening. So this forum will be posted online here in the next week or so. So if you are not comfortable being recorded, you can just turn off your video. That is completely up to you. But it is one thing we just wanted to let folks know ahead of time before we got started. Also, because there are so many of us on this call, it looks like we're up to 30. That's awesome. Just remember to keep your mute button on. That way we don't deal with background noises or phones ringing in the background. Unless, of course, you're speaking, then we want to make sure that that mute button is off. Another thing that I'd like to remind you of is that Zoom comes with a chat feature. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the little chat bubble. If you float toward the bottom, and if you click on it, a chat box will appear on the right. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, that's something I'll be keeping an eye on, and I can help feed those to our presenters. You also have the ability, one thing I'll point out, you can either chat to everyone in the group, or you can pick a particular person you'd like to chat to if you feel like you've got something to say one-on-one. So I just wanted to make sure you knew that feature was there. Now, for an overview of the evening, before we dive in, I'd like to let you know a little bit about the overall structure before we get going. So right now, I just wanted to start off with a basic welcome and overview, which is what we're in the middle of. And then we're going to move in to presentations from our three panelists. And we have three fantastic panelists lined up this evening, each of whom I'll tell you a little bit more about. But each panelist, that they will have 10 minutes to present sort of on a different area related to conservation easements. So after each one of those 10-minute presentations, Those three panelists will then come together for another 10 minutes to have a discussion amongst each other, just to give them an opportunity to respond to some of the points that were made in their own presentations. And then after that, we open up the floor to questions from our group here. And how we're going to do questions, I'll say this because it'll go back to the chat box. When the panelists are presenting, again, that's when you want to put those questions in the chat box. And at the end of their presentation, I'll come back and make sure that all of the questions are addressed. Now, when we get closer toward the end of the forum and it's the question and answer session, the chat box will remain open, but you will also be able to ask questions by spoken word as well if you would prefer. So there'll be a little bit more an extra option there. And then my job as moderator will be my job to make sure that all those questions get answered as the hands go up or that the voices start to speak. So we just, again, this is an opportunity to learn, and learning happens both ways when you can listen, but also ask. So we want to make sure that you have time to hear, but then also to respond. And then we will wrap up at the conclusion of the forum. And as promised, everyone who has participated in this forum, they will have an opportunity to receive a complimentary one-year membership, digital membership to the American Farmland Trust, as well as one of those awesome bumper stickers, "No farms, no food." So at the end of the presentation, we will send you a link to a Google document where, if you're interested in either one of those or both of those fine little freebies, that you'll be able to sign up, and we'll make sure that you get the information you need. So that is pretty much just a little bit of a recap of some of the fun things we can look forward to. So before we jump into the meat of talking to the panelists, I guess I should pause for a moment to see if there's anything I've left off from the technological end, or anybody else who has a burning question from the beginning. Oh my goodness, look at all these wonderful faces. I feel like a teacher living a dream. Okay. Well then, fantastic. Let's go ahead and let's get this show on the road. And I would like to start by introducing our first panelist for the evening. And our first panelist, she's here to help us understand the basics of conservation easements, what they are, their benefits, how the process works, and more. So please join me in welcoming Ashley Greathouse, who is Counsel and Director of Bluegrass Lands Conservancy. She has over 13 years of experience in negotiating and preparing conservation easements and baseline documentation reports. Ashley has a Juris Doctor from the University of Kentucky and has been managing the Conservation Easement and Stewardship Program at BLC since 2007. Prior to Bluegrass Land Conservancy, Ashley was an associate attorney at McBrayer Law Firm in Lexington, Kentucky, where she focused primarily on real estate litigation issues. So, Ashley, I know you are out there. Whenever you are ready, the stage is yours.
Hi, Whitney. Thank you so much for having me tonight, and thank you to all of you tonight for joining us. Like Whitney said, I will start off with kind of the basics of conservation easements, and then I know Billy is going to fill us in on more of the big picture work that American Farmland Trust is doing across the country. So I'll do a short recap really on Bluegrass Land Conservancy, who we are and where we work. Bluegrass Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land trust, and we focus in 24 counties in the Bluegrass region of Kentucky. We hold 138 conservation easements currently, and that encompasses about 29,130 acres of land. And we should be closing another 5 easements by December 31st of this year. So we'll hit our 30,000 acre mark, which has been our goal. We're really excited about that. So anyway, I will just kind of jump into what a conservation easement is, and that's going to be the same really for any type of a land trust that you're working with, whether that's a local nonprofit land trusts like us, or a governmental entity like the PDR program in Fayette County. So these are just kind of basics that would be generally the same throughout. But really, a conservation easement is it's a written agreement between a landowner and a land trust that is a tax-exempt organization qualifying under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, or a governmental agency. The agreement describes the rights associated with the land that the owner is relinquishing, and the specific rights the landowner is relinquishing are tailored to the situation, taking into account the landowner's desires and the donee entity's requirements and policies. Entering into the easement is a voluntary act by each party. The donee entity is assuming the responsibility of monitoring the property and enforcing the easement's restrictions throughout the perpetual term of the easement. When the landowner transfers the property on which a conservation easement exists, the transferee takes the property subject to the easement, so the restrictions stay in place for future owners. A conservation easement generally is not required to allow public access to the property. However, it may do so if the landowner desires. There are potential income tax benefits associated with conservation easement donations, which is what we've primarily done as an organization over our history. Those income tax benefits result from the characterization of a donation as a charitable contribution. A charitable contribution for a conservation easement is allowable only if it meets the requirements of a qualified contribution, according to the IRS. For a conservation easement to meet these requirements, it must be donated to a qualified organization, which would be Bluegrass Land Conservancy or another governmental entity, and must be made exclusively for charitable purposes. A qualified organization is a governmental unit or a publicly supported charitable organization, but not a private foundation. And that's an important distinction later on when it comes to the tax benefits. The donee entity must have a commitment to protect the donation's conservation purposes and the resources to enforce the easement's restrictions. To qualify for a conservation easement, one or more conservation purposes must be satisfied. Those purposes are open space and scenic, including farmland or forested land for the scenic enjoyment of the general public, the preservation of land for outdoor recreation by or for education of the general public, the protection of a relatively natural habitat of fish, wildlife, or plants or similar ecosystems, or the preservation of a historically important land area or a certified historic structure. As noted earlier, the easements must be perpetual. They also must be entered into voluntarily to qualify. For example, a land use concession by a local government on a tract of land in exchange for a conservation easement on another tract owned by the same person would not qualify. A potential charitable contribution tax deduction available to the landowner is based on the diminution in value and the fair market value of the land resulting from the restrictions contained in the easement. That's determined by a qualified appraiser that would go out and they would value the fair market value of the land in the before scenario, and then they would also determine the fair market value of the land as restricted. So the difference between those two values is the conservation value attributed to the landowner, which they can use for their tax deduction. And in 2015, Congress extended the ability for landowners to deduct up to 50% of their adjusted gross income for a contribution of a conservation easement in the year of the gift, and then they could carry forward whatever they don't use in that first year for up to 16 years. So that's a huge benefit for a landowner. Just as an example, let's say that a landowner has a property that is valued, the conservation value of the property determined by an appraiser, let's say it's $1 million, just because those are easy numbers. So they have $1 million write-off that they could potentially use. And let's say that the landowner makes $100,000 a year in adjusted gross income. The landowner could deduct $50,000 in their first year or the year of the gift. They would be taxed as if they made $50,000 rather than $100,000. And then they would be able to carry forward that remaining $950,000 for up to 16 years. So it's pretty substantial. People are usually very happy with that tax benefit. However, if you're considered a qualified farmer by the IRS, which a lot of people in this area are, then they're actually eligible for 100% deduction from their adjusted gross income, which can also be carried forward for up to 16 years. So that's determined by if you make more than 50% of your income from farming activities, then you're considered a qualified farmer by the IRS, and therefore you're allowed to deduct that 100% rather than the 50%. I know there are a lot of numbers being thrown around right now. It's a lot of information. I know it can be quite complex, but needless to say, it is something that can make a huge difference for people's bottom lines by doing a conservation easement. There are also substantial estate tax benefits associated with doing a conservation easement. Those estate tax benefits, I don't know how relevant they are right now for most people, but they are going to reduce the taxable, they're going to reduce your taxable estate by reducing the value of your property that's protected in your estate by that original diminution in value. And then there's an additional Internal Revenue Code provision allowing for another 40% reduction of the value of your property. It's capped at $500,000, but it can make a huge difference if you have really high valued land and you don't want your children to have to sell the farm to pay estate taxes. So it's a really, really great estate planning tool for people to use. So we do work with people's estate planners to make sure that they can keep their farms in their families. So those are some of the tax benefits associated with easements. I know I only have 10 minutes, so I'm running through that pretty quickly. Just as far as the process is involved, I'm speaking kind of in relation to Bluegrass Land Conservancy, but I would imagine that the process is fairly similar for most organizations. But really it starts with an initial site visit with our landowners. If somebody gives us a call, they'll be talking to me or somebody else from the land protection team. And if they're interested, after a brief phone call conversation, we like to go out and meet with someone on their property and just talk to them specifically about those benefits that we discussed, and then really how they envision the future of their land. So how we would set up the terms of the conservation easement. All of the terms of our easements, not all of them, but most of our terms in the boilerplate language anyway are required by the IRS, but the terms of the easement related to how many future residences are allowed, potentially how many future divisions of the property that you might want, those types of things. We want to work with the landowner to make sure that they have this project set up in the way that best suits their family for future generations. So we'll meet with them, take a look around, talk about their needs, and then after that, if the landowner is interested in moving forward, they just need to let us know. Letting us know can consist of an email, a phone call, and we run that through our Land Protection and Stewardship Committee. It's not binding at that point. They just let us know whether or not we're allowed to spend resources moving through the project. So we come out then, if the committee okays it, and we do a baseline documentation report on the property where we document all the conservation values, like the scenic view sheds and the water resources. We document all of the existing structures on the property. And then we work with the landowner negotiating those terms, and we draft all of the documents in-house. We do a title search on the property, and once we're finished with all of that, we send everything to the landowner and their council to review. Once we all agree on all the final terms, our board reviews and votes on all the final terms of our projects. And then after that, we sit down with the landowner, we'll do a closing and record it in the county clerk's office. Hopefully by December 31st. So this time of year is always really, really busy for us. In order for you to receive a tax deduction for the year that you are working in, you have to record it by the 31st. So then we work with the appraiser to determine the appraisal. That doesn't have to be done till a little bit later. Just it has to be completed by the time you file your taxes in the following year. And then after that, we are holding your easement in perpetuity. So we have a stewardship team, and we come out and we monitor the land every year. We set up a time to meet with you and come out and walk the property and just answer questions and make sure everything is as it should be. And we deal with people when they transfer their property and make sure that the new landowners are aware of all the restrictions and meet us and become part of our community. So it really is a long-term relationship. We really love our landowners and get to know each other, and we really do value that relationship and look forward to those visits every year. And yeah, so I'll let Billy, I guess, jump in here. That's kind of the nutshell of a conservation easement, the tax benefits, and then also that process to complete it.
And I tell you what, Ashley, thank you, first of all. Before you jump in, Billy, that we did have one question pop up, and I want to go ahead and make sure that, go ahead and send it your way. And this is from Carmel Bowman. She was wondering, does the organization ask for the landowner to help with the cost of protecting the easement? If so, how is that figured?
We have internalized all of the costs associated with protecting the land. So we pay for a title attorney to run the title on the property. We don't charge the landowner to draft documents or do the baseline documentation report, nothing like that. And we figured all of those costs, and it's about $25,000 to $30,000 per project that the organization essentially pays for itself. The landowner, however, is required to pay for the appraisal. The IRS does not let the land trust pay for the appraisal. That has to be, we have to be hands off in that process. So that is a landowner cost, is just the appraisal fee. And then we do like to have, we want the landowner to be represented by their own counsel in the transaction. So those advisor fees, an attorney perhaps, or maybe an accountant that represents the landowner. So that's going to be a cost to the landowner. We also do request, we don't require, a stewardship contribution, and that is also required by the IRS, that we have to have a certain amount of dollars in place for each project that we have. And so we put that money into a stewardship endowment fund, which pays for our annual fees for our terra firma insurance. We insure each one of our we insure each one of our conservation easements with terra firma, so that if we do have a violation in the future, our terra firma insurance helps us pay our legal fees so we can defend our conservation easement. And that stewardship fee is based on the acreage and the reserved rights that the landowner would like to retain. It varies anywhere between $4,200 up to $8,500. And some, like, extraordinary properties might be a little bit higher, but that's a one-time fee, and it is also tax deductible. We have set it up so that landowners can pay that however they'd like. They can pay it over a number of years. They can pay it all at once. We don't have anything in place necessarily that forces you to do it in a particular way. We also do have a stewardship fund within our organization, so that if a landowner really wants to protect their land, but excuse me, but they can't pay the stewardship fee, sorry, our organization can fund that project. I mean, as long as we have the money in there. Right now, I think we have $20,000. So we have actually 2 projects this year that are requesting assistance through our stewardship fund assistance program. So those are the only fees associated, sorry about that, with our program.
Thank you, Ashley. All right, now I would like to introduce our next panelist. And so please joining me in welcoming Billy Van Pelt, the Senior Director of External Relations at American Farmland Trust, where his role includes expanding AFT's work across the Southeast and the nation. He grew up on his grandparents' cattle and tobacco farm on US 60 in Woodford County, Kentucky, where a love of farm was ingrained in him at a very early age. Billy is a registered landscape architect, and he has 25 years of experience in land use planning and farmland protection. So welcome, Billy. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Jane, if you'll start the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I know that I'm also limited on time. Okay, well, we'll get started. I've already been introduced, so we can go to the next slide right away. So this is really how American Farmland Trust is recognized by most people. These our tagline: "Saving the land that sustains us. Farming is our future. No farms, no food." We've already talked about the bumper sticker, but we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We're 40 years old, and this is our 40-year anniversary. We were started in 1980. We're a research and science organization, and because of our nonpartisan nature, we always have a seat at the table. Next slide. So I won't read through all of this, but I'll let you see just sort of the milestones in the history of the organization. We really created the ag conservation movement. We're the only national organization that takes a holistic approach towards agriculture and farmland protection. Perhaps most notably, we've helped secure $2 billion in funding for the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, which is really equal to $4 billion in funding to purchase conservation easements. And because they require some type of a match, we've directly protected 71,000 acres. We are a land trust, but we typically do not hold easements where there's a viable qualified entity in place. And we've worked with partners to permanently protect 6.8 million acres of farmland and rangeland nationwide. Next slide. As an organization, we have 115 employees. Many of them are remote. I'm a remote employee, and most of us have been working remotely anyway since mid-March. These are where our offices are located around the nation. Next slide. We have a series of national initiatives. I'm going to touch on Farms Under Threat in just a bit, but we also have national initiatives around next generation farmers, regenerative ag, climate, women for the land. Women now own over a third of the farmland in the US, over 300 million acres. And we have a national initiative around that, that paradigm that we're in and that continues to grow. Water quality, solar siting, and state and federal policy, as well as the Farm Bill. Next slide. We're going to watch this brief video. This is very short. This gives you a real overview. I hope we have sound.
Jane's troubleshooting that.
Okay.
Hopefully, maybe.
Well, if not, Jane, you can put a link to the video in the chat box if we can't get sound, and we can get back to the presentation.
Hey, can you not hear it at all? There's still
No.
not a sound? Okay.
No.
Carmel says there's a button on the share screen that adds sound for a video, if that helps.
Okay. I have several screens up. Hold on a second.
Yeah, we're still not hearing anything.
Okay.
We might just have to drop the link in for later,
Yeah,
as Billy suggested.
we can place that link in the chat box and you can listen to it at your convenience.
Okay.
All right, we'll go back to the PowerPoint, please. All right. So we can go ahead and get into Farms Under Threat. Next slide. Farms Under Threat is the most comprehensive land cover analysis that's ever been undertaken in our nation. And it covers a period of 2001 to 2016. Next slide. It's a multi-year initiative, as I said, and it's identifying our most productive, versatile, and resilient soils across the nation. Next slide. And we're identifying threats to ag land and connecting those to policy responses in every state. So this is a 3-phase project. The first phase was a look backwards as a nation. This phase, which is the second of 3 phases, that identifies and reports out on every state in the continental US. And then the third phase is going to be about projecting out to 2040. Next slide. So this map says a lot. So all of the dark green and light green, those are the most productive, versatile, and resilient soils in the US. The dark yellow and the light yellow are the most productive rangelands in the US. The dark gray are highly urbanized areas, and the red represents sprawl. Next slide. Okay, next slide. We're just focusing on ag lands here with this. So this legend that you see explains this more in detail. And if you squint your eyes, you can barely see Lexington's urban services area. And you can also see all of the productive, versatile, and resilient soils that we have in central Kentucky and elsewhere in Kentucky. But you can see the legend there. Your darkest greens and your lightest greens, those are your PBR soils. Your dark grays and light grays are your woodland and forested areas. And then your very dark reds are your highly urbanized. So look at Atlanta. You can see Atlanta and all the low density residential around that. You can see Louisville very clearly. You can see Nashville and so on. Next slide. And we've covered this. We're identifying the best ag lands. Next slide. So this just has the soils themselves on there. You can see the range. There's a spectrum of the very high, productive, versatile, and resilient soils and that whole range. So there's a lot in this country, but they are finite. Next slide. These are your nationally significant ag lands. These are even more finite. And if we zoomed in on these states, you'd see a little bit more, but these soils are even more rare. Next slide. So we've mapped this conversion. Next slide. And we all know, I don't have to explain this, we know what urban high density development looks like, and that's indicated here on the left. Next slide. But low density residential is what we've identified here. And these are the McMansions, the large residential lots, as they say in friends of ours that I'm sure Ashley knows, our friends, too much to mow and not enough to grow. And this bottom picture was actually taken in Fayette County. Next slide. So I won't read this. I'll let you read this for yourself. You can see that we converted 11 million acres of ag land in that 15-year period, and what a threat low density residential is, with 7 million acres being converted to low density residential, and how much of that conversion occurred on this very finite, nationally significant land. Next slide. So breaking it out state by state helps you see this a little bit more. You can see the states that are really have this proliferation, and you can see a lot of it is in the Southeast, especially Georgia. Next slide. So as you can see acres converted and the percent of farmland converted here. So it keeps coming back to the Southeast and Texas. So that's why I'm primarily focused on the Southeast, and we're expanding our operations programmatically in the Southeast in a very material way. Next slide. So this is the ranking of the top 12 most threatened states across the nation, with Texas being #1. But you can clearly see that the Southeast is represented very strongly here. Next slide. And I just want to say here that American Farmland Trust, we share all of our research and data. So this is a link if you want to, you can actually go in and search by state yourself. You can look at all of the shapefiles and data layers for every state yourself and explore this site. That's the link. Our primary website is farmland.org. This is a microsite for this project. And we also have a third website called farmlandinfo.org. And that is an office that is staffed by people that house and manage all of our data. And so I encourage you to check that out as well. Farmlandinfo.org is the third one. Next slide. So here's Kentucky, a close-up view of Kentucky. So we see Lexington in the urban services area. We see Louisville. We see the proliferation of low-density residential around Louisville. You know, Lexington is pretty compact because we've had an urban services boundary that's expanded and contracted over over 50 years, hasn't been expanded since 1996. But you can see we have a lot of PVR soils in the inner and outer bluegrass regions, which is the Bluegrass Land Conservancy service area that Ashley was talking about earlier. Next slide. In the red, I'll say here, the red represents the low density. So the policy responses, next slide. As we go through this, and just keep clicking, please, Jane, that we're focusing on 6 approaches in every state to assess the policy responses to farmland conversion. Next slide. And just keep clicking, please. So this is what we're looking at: PACE programs, purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs, land use planning, ag districts, property tax relief, and there should be another one, and farm link programs and state leasing. Next slide. So every state can do more. So this is the policy response. You know, Kentucky has, you know, you can see where we rank there in terms of policy response and where the lowest states are that have very low policy response. Next slide. So this spectrum here, this graphic shows you where Kentucky is. We have a very high threat to farmland conversion, yet we have a very low response. While many counties in central Kentucky and counties across Kentucky and across the Southeast and across the nation, some are more progressive with their planning than others. They have farmland protection programs, they have large lot minimums in the rural areas, they have urban growth boundaries and ag zoning, and some don't. Next slide, please. So this is the, again, go to that website if you would like more information. And next slide. And this is my email address, bvanpelt@farmland.org. I'm happy to answer any questions offline. But this is very exciting. I'll mention the third phase of this project that is happening now. We are projecting out to 2040 because we have two major goals in response to this research. One is to double the amount of permanently protected farmland in this country by 2040. And the second is to increase funding for farmland protection across the nation. And so we're very focused on this, but the third phase of this project is looking at 2040, and we're projecting out, and we're looking at housing densities, population increases, and climate change. We're not saying what's causing climate change, we're just acknowledging that it's changing. The coastal states are going to be under the greatest threat with sea level rise because much of the productive, versatile, and resilient soils in those states are inland. So as people begin to move off the coast in Florida and the coastal states, that PVR land, productive, versatile, and resilient land, will be even under greater threat. So that third phase is actually a county by county research project. So we are going to be looking at 2040 county by county in states and regions across the nation. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Billy. Excellent. And I can see here that Carmel, you posted a couple pictures, and pictures. No, you haven't. A couple of questions, and I'll tell you, I can see them, but we'll come back to them at the end of the question and answer session. That way, we know we've got them lined up and ready to go. But to keep us moving along, and in the interest of time, I would like to go ahead and I would like to introduce our third panelist. And I'll go ahead and say where we're having some camera difficulties. So our third panelist, although we cannot see her, we can most definitely hear her. And I would like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Lyda Oxnard. She's a family medical specialist in Bardstown, Kentucky, who has over 30 years of experience in the medical field. She grew up among the farmlands of Pennsylvania, but now lives in rural Nelson County, where her property backs up to the Abbey of Gethsemane. She is a local advocate for sustainable living. In addition to holding a conservation easement, her property also features 23 solar panels. Dr. Oxnard and Lyda, just to get things rolling and to help you set the stage, I think it would be great if I know I've chatted with you a little bit, but if you don't mind sharing with folks, what was it that got you interested in establishing a conservation easement, and just tell us a little bit about your journey and share some of your perspective. We'll get you unmuted first. And I still see that your little we were testing earlier. Oh, we were testing earlier and we were able to chat, but it looks like your microphone is still muted right now. Probably want to go to the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and you'll want to unmute yourself if at all possible. Well, I'll tell you what, Dr. Oxnard, while you work on that, because we can come back to you, I know you've got plenty of good things to share, that I can bounce back to the chat box, but let us know if you get unmuted. And Billy, I'll bounce back to you because there was one question that Carmel Bowman asked. The first one, she was wondering, does AFT work in Indiana?
Yes.
Well, that's a nice and easy answer.
And if you would like, I'll put my email address in the chat box for everyone. I will do an e-introduction to you and someone on our Midwest team and take care of that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Billy. And then this question, because let's see, I'm looking. First, I'm just checking to see if Lida got unmuted yet. I don't think so. So we'll go ahead and we'll jump into this next question. And that is also from Carmel. And she asked, how would someone find a site planner to help figure out specifics of a potential ag conservation easement or residential lot plan?
I think this is a question for Ashley.
Hi there. I would actually start with, if you're interested in a conservation easement, it's something that I would say that we would come out to the property really and kind of walk through the conservation plan side of it. The residential lot planning part, yeah, I don't know. I mean, we basically just work with the landowners to try to identify those areas that are the least sensitive, that would work the best as far as the future residential site locations. And then also where those sensitive areas are that we want to make sure we protect the most. I mean, we have GIS layers like Billy was showing in his presentation. Ours are much more localized, obviously, to individual properties. So we pull conservation information for each individual property based on our data that's in our GIS layers. So I think we would be a good starting point if it's something that's really complex. You know, we can, the appraisers actually kind of take a lot of that into consideration too when they're doing the appraisal. So they take care of a little bit of that. And then I guess, you know, there are site planners and things of that nature. We've actually never had a landowner that has used one in conjunction with our easements. We have seen people come to the table with a site plan, I guess, for like future houses, but typically it's just a negotiation between us and the landowner.
Thank you, Ashley. That's excellent. We're working behind the scenes to get Dr. Oxnard back online. But in the meantime, another question has come up for you, Billy. Jesse Rathburn was wondering, the maps that you used, are those available on the AFT website, or is there some other way that we could access those?
They are available, and while we move on, I will be placing a link to that information for everyone in the chat box.
Excellent. Thank you, Billy.
You're welcome.
Very much appreciated. And I'll go ahead. I'm taking a look. I'm not seeing Dr. Oh, go ahead. Let's see. It looks like we've got a question for Ashley. So this is from Ann Harrison. Who decides the appraisal from the conservation point of view?
The landowner chooses the appraiser. So they have to use a qualified conservation easement appraiser, which means they have to have taken the IRS required course to be able to do these types of easements or these types of transactions. And there are very few of those in Kentucky. I'll be very frank about that. We provide a list of the people that have worked with other landowners in the past. And so landowners are welcome to call and talk to those appraisers and figure out a good fit. There are national firms that do conservation easement appraisals, sometimes in conjunction with local appraisers. LandVest is one of them out of Boston that is very well respected and well known. But that's, we try to help provide, you know, resources, but that's a landowner decision, I guess you would say. Is that the question? I don't know if I answered, if that was the right, I think that was the question.
And feel free to chime in if you want. As to whether
I was just thinking about that, the difference between the appraisal by the conservation point of view versus the appraisal from the, you know, I don't know, property appraisal, because you said it's the difference between the two that really determines the tax
So,
component or the taxable write-off. So I was wondering, I mean, I presume that you use the PVA for the property value, and then you use the conservation person that you described for the conservation value?
so they use comparable sales to establish the fair market value, so that before number, and then they use comparable sales to establish the after value, so the value as if the property was conserved. So they'll look at the sale of other eased land to try to figure out comparable sales to establish what the property that they're appraising would be worth if it was conserved. So it's essentially trying to figure out the diminution in value attributed to the restrictions. They'll look at, certain counties have stricter zoning rules than others. And so maybe their average diminution in value would be a little higher than, let's say like Fayette County, who has very strict zoning regulations. Because of those strict zoning regulations, it's harder to develop property in Fayette County. So maybe their diminution in value might have a lower percentage than a property, for instance, in Oldham County or Shelby County, where it might be a little bit easier to develop it. So anyway, they'll look for comps to establish that diminution in value.
Thank you.
Both. Go ahead.
Oh, I just saw another question if you want me to answer that.
Yeah, you dig in. Go for it.
Are there ways that a tax-exempt organization like the religious congregations can take advantage of any tax benefits or tax credits? So no, not for the tax benefits, but as Billy was saying earlier, the Farm Bill has quite a bit of money allocated to land conservation throughout the country. And they've actually recently expanded the ability for land trusts like Bluegrass Land Conservancy to take advantage of some of those dollars. It used to be limited to matching funds, and the organization had to provide dollar for dollar matching funds to be able to purchase conservation easements. And this year they are now allowing for organizations to allow a landowner to use their donation. So a 50% match of like the funding through a donation instead of actual dollar for dollar cash, which is opening the opportunity for us to be able to provide the option for a purchased easement throughout our service area. We're trying to deal with that right now and figure out how to obviously there's not an unlimited pool of funds for that. So we are, as a board, looking at priority areas in our region, and we will be offering that to priority areas each year to kind of narrow that and to create critical mass of protected lands, so it's not so scattershot throughout the region. But I do think that, and we've actually talked about this as an organization, I do think that it would be a great use of that money to be able to purchase easements on lands, religious lands like these, where the landowners are not receiving a tax benefit for the donation of an easement. So this is all new for us. We are getting ready to close our first one, but I do think it's something that we could consider in the future. And it's definitely something I think if the religious groups got together, hopefully, it might be something that we could consider. And I don't know, since right now the donation side of it, that's a 50% donation. So like meaning like a tax benefit match, which the religious lands obviously would not get that 50% match benefit of the donation. So, I don't know if it's something that we could fundraise for or get funding through other organizations, maybe even AFT, I don't know, to help us do the dollar for dollar match for groups that are tax exempt. So these are all things we're working through, but it's really exciting in the world of conservation right now to have the opportunity to open some funding options up in Kentucky especially. So we're really looking forward to being able to utilize that in the future. And thank you to AFT, because I know they were a huge reason why the Farm Bill was expanded again. And hopefully we will be able to continue to use those funds in the future.
Well, thank you, Ashley, and for your leadership at Bluegrass Land Conservancy. You all do an amazing job, and we're proud to partner with you.
Thanks.
It looks like we've got another question. This one's coming from Beth Gore. It says, we understand that the easement is perpetual. Is there any way to revoke it?
No. I'm going to go ahead and say no. It would be very, very unlikely. There would have to be no conservation value left on the property to terminate a conservation easement. That would have to be done by a judge. So we cannot decide as a land trust, in agreement with the landowner to terminate the easement. It's very difficult to do, and the threshold is really that there is no conservation value left on the property would be the only reason it would be allowed to be extinguished. We have actually done an extinguishment in part because of an eminent domain proceeding for a roadway expansion on a property. So, I mean, we cannot protect against eminent domain. Nothing really can. So, in that limited capacity, we can do an extinguishment there. But it was a very large easement, 900 acres. And I think they only took maybe 1.2 acres on just of road frontage. But we still had to have a judicial determination for the termination of the easement.
Ashley, can I ask a question? I want to go back to this religious congregations. If we wanted to put an easement on our property and we don't care about the tax credits and the tax.
I didn't hear all of it. I think you said, are you with a religious group? Are you a private landowner?
Yes.
You're a private
yes.
landowner? Okay. And you said if you don't care about the tax.
No, I'm with the Sisters. No. Right. Because I think all the religious congregations right now are looking at that possibility. So if we don't care whether we get a tax credit or whatever, can we do a conservation easement?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And there are many benefits to doing it without meeting without having to meet the IRS requirements or the NRCS. NRCS is the organization through the Farm Bill that provides funding. So both the IRS and NRCS have very strict, very rigid. When I say very strict and very rigid, they're manageable and our easements are great. And I think most people are very happy with them, but you do have to meet certain regulations and there are minimum terms that are required. There are a lot of hoops to jump through. And if you do want to do a conservation easement, but you're not really concerned about the tax benefits or the funding through NRCS, so having the federal government involved in your easement, which is a pretty, there are a lot of hoops to jump through for that too, then you have a lot more flexibility with the terms of your easement. So we can really design those easements in a way that the landowner has a much stronger voice in how they want that drafted. So, which is what we are, currently doing with these different groups. We definitely have a template easement, but we are willing and ready and able to have a lot more flexibility with the terms for these organizations because they're not subject to the IRS or NRCS guidelines and minimum terms. I think that's what you were asking. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
No problem.
That's great. And there are a couple of other questions that have popped up in the chat box. And I think these two, even though asked by different people, they're they sort of connected. The first, someone asked, would a landowner ever not be able to enter into an easement? And then the second one is, can you give an example of conservation value? Are there lands that are nice, but not considered to have conservation value? So we can start with that first one. Is there a reason for that a landowner couldn't enter into the easement?
Well, our board, for instance, does choose or vote on whether they're going to accept each project. So theoretically, our board could decide that, it just wasn't a property that they wanted to expend funds on because of our capacity that year. It maybe didn't have, the conservation values they were looking for. It may be pretty far away from other protected lands. We don't turn a lot of easements down because we know we're one of the few land trusts working in this region, if not the only one in many of the areas. So if somebody wants to protect their land, we do try to figure out a way to make that happen. Most land does have conservation value in this area. I can't really think of any project that's ever been presented to us that doesn't have conservation value. Which is that next question. So, an example of conservation values would be like what Billy was showing us in the slides with the soils information. That's super important. Obviously, the soil quality and all of that. And then also, we do protect wooded areas and water resources, wetlands, all of those things would be conservation values. Scenic view sheds, so road frontage is really important. The more road frontage a property has, we feel like we're protecting it from development more. So those would all be conservation values that we would be looking at and documenting in our baseline documentation report. The only landowner, though, that would not be able to enter into an easement, there are landowners that cannot restrict their land. That was the question I just read, but that's pretty rare too. We've had a couple of those throughout our organization's history where there are certain trust agreements that own property that have provisions that restrict them from being able to devalue property. So that would be an instance where someone could not actually enter into an agreement with us. But that's really, really rare, and trust documents really aren't drafted that way much anymore. So that's not something that we run into very often.
You've got another question, this one from Sister Claire. So this comes back to, BLC. In addition to protecting the development rights on the property, is BLC able to protect the methods of agriculture that future owners might want to use that would be abusive to soil, water, etc.?
Technically, I guess we could have terms that restrict different types of agricultural uses. I guess that's what she was asking. We don't really do that with our typical template. We have an underlying restriction against impairing the conservation values of our property. So any agricultural use or method on the property that's impairing the conservation values would be a violation. You do have that to protect methods of agricultural use in the future, protecting from erosion and things like that. So overgrazing, those types of activities, we would be able to capture that in other ways, but we don't have specific restrictions on types of agricultural use, except we do in a handful of our, more than a handful, have restrictions on chicken, poultry operations, things like that that are not necessarily what we would consider land-based agricultural uses. However, they do fall into the agricultural category in Kentucky. So we do try to restrict things based on impervious surfaces. So if the agricultural activity requires a significant amount of impervious surface coverage, then that would be an excluded use. We have a 2% impervious surface limitation for all of our easements. So we go about it in a different way, I guess would be the best way to say that.
Well, and when
Hey,
you
I have
talk
a
about,
question.
go ahead, jump in.
Easements. Ashley, you mentioned highway easements a while ago. What about gas lines, power lines, railroads, all these other things? And, you know, an LG&E pipeline is going through Bernheim. LG&E is one thing, but these gas lines that they're repurposing for carrying all this waste from fracking back down to the Gulf Coast, what if they wanted to come through you? When you go to an easement and you got a big block of land, you're very open territory. And it's just easy to figure going right through the most open territory that you can figure for a power line or anything. What about that? How much difference would that do? I understand a highway is one thing, but a gas line or something like that's underground.
So we are pretty limited on if they do take it for eminent domain purposes or condemnation. So if a governmental entity takes it through condemnation or eminent domain, then we can fight it just like a landowner would fight it. So we would be a partner with the landowner in that battle, but I mean the easement cannot prohibit that if they end up taking it. There's just no way really to prohibit that. I mean, there's really no instrument that can do that. But we are a partner, and we do have insurance through Terra Firma to help us fight these battles. Terra Firma has limitations on condemnation and eminent domain proceedings too, but you know, it is something that we do get involved in. We've had 4 of them so far. It's all been with road widenings, but we do get involved. We do try to mitigate based on our easements. You know, we do have a pretty strong voice in this region in particular, and we do try to use that in those types of situations if we can. We obviously wouldn't be happy about that. You know, I mean, it would violate our easement. But we do take properties subject to utility easements. And so if we take a project that's already subject to a utility easement, there's really not a lot we can do if it's recorded prior to our easement. You know, that's just kind of a real estate law and title issue. I mean, if they have a power line easement that's going over your property and you know, we're kind of just, we know that going into it and we accept it based on that information. There's not a whole lot we can do if the easement itself says that it can be expanded. We're taking that project subject to what it already says. But in the future, you know, if somebody comes in and wants to do these projects, you know, you're not supposed to do them according to the easement. So we have a prohibition against, you know, selling your property to do, you know, transmission lines and all of that. So I mean, they can still condemn it and put them in, but it's a prohibition of voluntarily agreeing to it.
Well, the next question I have concerning about all of this, you got the 2 values. You got the conservation value and you got the real development value. If they come in and take part of it, how much, you know, what's going to be the ramifications of that? Are we going to have to pay money back, or, you know, we've already taken the tax and so forth?
That's a great question. So you're asking if it's terminated, who gets the money from the government, who gets the proceeds? Is that what you're saying? That was your question?
Yeah, well, you know, if they come across the farm with, say, a power line and you get compensated, where does that money go?
So that's a great question. And that is very clearly articulated in the Internal Revenue Service guidelines and code, and in our CS provisions for easements. So we would have we're required to be compensated based on the percentage diminution determined at the time of the gift. So let's say that when your appraiser does your easement transaction, let's say they said that the easement devalued your property by 20% when you did your original donation. So when the entity that's the condemning authority or whoever it is, let's say that they come in and they offer you $100,000 for, you know, your utility easement or your road frontage or whatever that is, we would be required to receive 20% of that amount. So that would be $20,000 in that scenario. We would be required to receive those proceeds because of the, you know, donation that you gave earlier and the tax benefit you received. But we are also required to use that money for similar conservation purposes. with a priority to be used back on that, like similar conservation purposes as detailed in the conservation easement. So it's very likely that you will want to do conservation projects and remediation based on whatever taking happened. And so we are required to use those dollars to help with those conservation projects. We can't just put it back into our general operating fund. So it kind of works out, you know, in the end for everybody. It's just a little bit of a process, some regulations, but so yeah, I mean, we just had to give, you know, we just went through this whole thing. We received, you know, $75,000, and we were literally turning around and giving it right back to the landowner for conservation projects. So that's how that would all work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great questions. Thank you. And I know that Richie asked a question earlier, and I want to make sure we get back to that one. And she'd ask, when the landowner is, you know, on the property, what are the restrictions for land use? Are specifically crops and livestock, are they restricted?
Not for our easements, no. I mean, you can have like a forever wild easement or something like that, but I doubt Billy or AFT is dealing with any of those really. Our organization doesn't do those. That would be somebody that does more of like those natural habitat easements. Our easements do allow for agricultural use, crops and livestock. We can and we do encourage people to have restrictions on wetlands and things like that where necessary. So you can, you know, have those restricted from grazing potentially, but it's not a requirement. That's just a term we negotiate with the landowners.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, we got another question just popped up. What happens when the landowner sells the land?
The easement goes with it. So the landowner sells the land subject to the conservation easement, and that new landowner steps into that role as grantor. They're subject to the same restrictions as the grantor. We would like to know about it so we can meet these people and make sure that our easement's properly referenced and the landowner knows it's protected, you know, all those types of things. We have had people sell it, shockingly, to people that don't know that there was an easement, which is never a good situation. So we do like to be involved in all of those, you know, just letting us know. We're not going to do anything, but just letting us know what's going on and just, you know, making sure we're all in the loop. But yeah, it runs with the land.
Thank you. Well, looking at the clock, we're coming to the end of the forum. There is one thing I want to let you all know, that Dr. Oxnard, she lost her connection and kept trying and trying and trying to reconnect. But I suppose when you live on a beautiful rural property held in a conservation easement, sometimes internet isn't always the most reliable. But she sends her heartfelt apologies. And again, if you ever get a chance to speak with her to hear a little bit about her own journey and you know, becoming an easement holder, she's really quite inspiring to talk to. But as we round things out, I want to let you know again, don't forget for resources on conservation easements. You can see that from the time and the passion that both Billy and Ashley have shared with us, that Bluegrass Land Conservancy and then the American Farmland Trust are two huge resources. So Billy has shown a number of, he's listed some websites here. If you go to the website of either organization, the contact information is there. They are here to assist. And then also here at New Pioneers, we are here to help, you know, help make connections, help provide information. So if there's anything we can assist with, even if it's getting you in contact with the right people, don't hesitate to reach out. And as promised, for anyone who participated in the forum, if you were interested in getting that AFT membership or one of those fabulous stickers, Jane posted a Google Docs link there in the chat. So if you click on that, all you have to do is give us your name, email address, and address so we know where to send everything. There's also a box for comments that are optional. So if you feel like dropping us a comment, you are welcome to leave that on the Google form. And with that, I just want to thank everyone again for sharing your evening with us and coming online to yet another Zoom meeting for so many of you who are Zooming today. And I want to thank our panelists, Ashley and Billy. Thank you so much for working with me in advance to plan all of the intricacies. And then again, for sharing your time with us and helping us plant these seeds of conservation here in Kentucky. So I thank you all. I see Luke's putting up the high five. Excellent, excellent, excellent. And I know myself and Jane will hang on here a few more minutes. If anyone has any questions or anything they want to follow up, we'll be on here a little bit longer. But otherwise, y'all enjoy your evening, and thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Excellent group. Thank you so much. Looking good. Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. I see your hand up.